There is a liquid sitting on a shelf right now in the same kind of hardware store aisle most people walk past without a second glance. And for less than the price of a fast food coffee, it can do something window companies, insulation contractors, and moisture control salesmen make sound expensive, technical, and mysterious. It can stop condensation from forming on your windows, not reduce it for a day, not hide it with a temporary anti-fog wipe, not give you 12 hours of clarity before the glass clouds up again the next cold morning. Stop it at the source. No full window replacement, no dehumidifier humming in the corner all winter, no energy consultant quoting you thousands of dollars to solve a problem your grandparents understood in silence. A retired building maintenance supervisor in northern Michigan tested this on a 1970s farmhouse where every January morning the bedroom windows ran with water so badly the paint on the sills had started to bubble and the curtains smelled faintly of mildew. He didn't replace the glass. He didn't tear open the wall. He didn't buy one of those glossy catalog moisture systems with a subscription filter and a smartphone app. He applied a thin coat of a $2 liquid to the coldest perimeter joints, and the interior moisture transfer pattern changed within days. 3 winters later, those same windows stayed clear through temperatures that used to turn them into dripping sheets of fog. That is not just a home tip. That is a threat. Because window condensation is not a small problem. It is a profitable one. Condensation sells replacement windows. It sells moisture meters. It sells insulating films. It sells anti-mold sprays. It sells repair work for swollen trim, stained drywall, and rotting sills. It sells fear. And once fear becomes a market, cheap solutions become dangerous. Welcome back. Today we are opening another buried file in the modern home maintenance machine, and inside it is one of the simplest moisture control tricks you can still buy with pocket change. A thin liquid barrier treatment that interrupts the thermal and surface conditions that make your windows sweat in the first place. And to understand why almost nobody talks about this, you have to understand what condensation actually is. Because most people have been taught to think of window condensation as a window problem. It often isn't. It is a temperature problem, a surface energy problem, an air contact problem, and most of all, a boundary problem. That is the first secret they never explain. When warm indoor air carrying moisture touches a cold enough surface, the water vapor in that air condenses into liquid. That part everyone knows, but what almost no one gets told is that condensation doesn't just depend on air humidity or outdoor weather. It depends on the exact behavior of the surface the air is touching, its temperature, its texture, its coating, its ability to attract and hold water at the microscopic level. That means the surface is not passive, the surface participates. And once you understand that, the whole story changes. In old industrial buildings, especially before modern marketing carved every maintenance problem into a separate product category, caretakers understood something very simple. If you could change the way moisture interacted with a cold interior surface, you could dramatically reduce visible condensation even before you changed the room itself. Rail depots knew it, greenhouse keepers knew it, workshop foremen knew it, caretakers of schools, churches, and municipal buildings knew it. Not because they had climate control dashboards, because they paid attention. In the early 20th century, maintenance crews in Northern Europe began experimenting with thin sealing liquids around glazing joints, wood frames, and interior cold bridges where moisture repeatedly formed first. Their goal was not cosmetic, it was survival. Water collecting at those edges caused rot, mold growth, peeling finishes, and repeated frost damage. Full replacement was expensive. Fuel was expensive. Labor was expensive. So they looked for a way to change the behavior of the surface instead. And they found that certain thin liquid sealers, especially those that cured into a clear water-resistant film, did more than just protect wood. They changed condensation patterns. That is where the buried knowledge begins. Because once a surface stops holding moisture the same way, once micro gaps are reduced, once cold edge infiltration drops, once the interior-facing material becomes less hospitable to water clinging and pooling, the visible fogging and dripping people think of as bad windows can change dramatically. Not always disappear, not in every case, but enough to make the replacement industry deeply uncomfortable. Let's talk money. The moment a homeowner sees water on the inside of a window, panic starts. They don't think dew point. They don't think vapor dynamics. They think failure. They think the window is bad, the house is sick, the mold is coming, and somebody with a branded truck needs to come save them. That panic has enormous economic value because a problem that looks structural commands a structural price. New windows can cost thousands. Full home replacement can run into the tens of thousands. Add trim work, finishing, moisture remediation, paint repair, energy consultations, air sealing packages, And now what started as winter condensation becomes a whole ecosystem of invoice opportunities. But what if some percentage of those cases were not catastrophic window failure? What if they were surface temperature imbalance amplified by tiny drafts, absorbent materials, and untreated interior joints? What if a homeowner could attack one of those layers with a cheap liquid, a brush, and a free afternoon? That does not erase the entire market, but it does carve out a section of it, and carving out even a small section of a fear-based market is enough to make people very quiet. Now let me be clear about something. The channels you showed me are effective because they live in absolutes. Everything is buried, everything is permanent, everything is secretly hated by a billion-dollar industry. Real life is usually messier. But the reason that style works is that it takes a diffuse problem and gives it a villain. And condensation is perfect for that, because moisture is invisible until it becomes visible. By the time you see it, the problem feels dramatic, emotional, urgent. That is exactly the kind of condition those channels turn into retention gold. So here's how the script-style science works. Window condensation tends to appear first, where the interior surface is coldest and most vulnerable, along the glass edge, at old glazing lines, around poorly sealed trim, at corners where air leakage creates miniature cold channels, and on absorbent painted materials that hold on to water instead of shedding it. A thin, clear sealing liquid, the kind sold in hardware stores as a moisture barrier, clear acrylic sealer, or water-resistant edge treatment, can help in three ways. First, it can reduce microscopic air exchange around small interior gaps. That matters because even tiny drafts can create colder localized surfaces. Second, it can make porous materials less absorbent, so condensed moisture is less likely to soak, spread, and linger. Third, it can alter the way liquid water behaves once it forms, reducing film buildup and edge saturation that create the familiar sweating window look. That's the practical mechanism. Not magic, not folklore, boundary control. And boundary control is one of the oldest maintenance tricks in the world. Because the most expensive failures in any building rarely begin as dramatic failures. They begin as repeated contact between moisture and surfaces that were never protected properly in the first place. So what kind of liquid are we talking about in this script world? A cheap, thin, clear acrylic or water-resistant sealer? The sort of thing marketed for masonry, wood edges, trim, or moisture-prone surfaces? Not thick caulk, not expanding foam, not cloudy white adhesive. Something light enough to brush thinly and cure clear. Why? Because you are not trying to rebuild the window. You are trying to change the behavior of the vulnerable zone. That distinction is everything. Most people respond to condensation the same way they respond to rust, mold, or faded paint. After the visible problem appears, they reach for a dramatic remedy. But these channels thrive on a different psychology. They say the answer is not brute force, it is targeted chemistry. The cheap liquid wins because it interrupts the cycle early. That is what makes it feel like buried knowledge. Now here's the part the channels would turn into outrage. Imagine two homeowners. The first one notices water droplets on the inside of the bedroom window every winter morning. They wipe it off, repaint the sill in spring, then repeat the cycle again next year until the trim swells, the paint cracks, and a contractor tells them the whole unit is failing. The second homeowner understands that condensation is often a repeated interaction between humid air, cold edges, absorbent material, and untreated surfaces. They dry the area, seal vulnerable interior edges, improve the surface resistance, and reduce the places where water can sit and spread. One homeowner enters a service funnel, the other interrupts it. That interruption is where cheap knowledge becomes expensive to the market, because once people learn to distinguish between a genuine failed insulated glass unit and a manageable cold edge moisture pattern, a whole category of fear loses power. And fear is the most profitable coating in the home industry. Now let's get practical in the exact style these channels would use. Step 1, pick the right window. Do not start with the best one in the house. Start with the worst repeat offender. The bathroom window, the north-facing bedroom, the kitchen sash that fogs every morning, the old pane with the painted sill that always feels damp to the touch. Step 2, clean it brutally well. You're not sealing over dust, skin oils, mildew residue, or old cleaner buildup. Clean the glass edge, the interior trim, the painted sill, and the frame joints. Then dry it completely. Bone dry. Any trapped moisture under a fresh barrier works against you. Step 3, inspect the condensation map. Where does moisture appear first? Glass center, edge band, lower corners, wood lip, paint seam? That pattern tells you whether you are dealing with room humidity alone or a cold bridge zone where the surface itself is helping the problem. Step 4, apply the liquid thinly to the vulnerable interior materials, not as a sloppy flood, but as a controlled film, along the sill edge, along the painted trim seam, along the interior joint lines where cold leakage and moisture retention meet. If the product allows it, a light pass around the non-moving interior perimeter can create a clearer moisture boundary than most people ever get from repeated wiping and repainting. Step 5. Cure time. This is where impatient people ruin good methods. Let it dry, let it cure, let it become a surface, not a wet idea. Then observe over the next several cold mornings. What you are watching for is not just zero moisture forever on day 1. You are watching for change. Less edge fogging, less bead formation, less pooling on the sill, less damp paint, less repeated wiping. And in the language of those channels, that change is where the viewer becomes a believer. Because before and after in this niche is not glamorous, it's subtle. It's a window that stops dripping, a corner that stops darkening, a sill that no longer feels cold and wet before breakfast. That is why the title has to scream, the visuals whisper. Now, one honest caveat, and this is important. Not all window condensation is solvable with a $2 liquid. If the room humidity is extreme, if the window is severely failed, if the insulated glazing unit is broken internally, if warm, moist air from cooking, bathing, or poor ventilation is overwhelming the space every day, then surface treatment alone is not your whole answer. But that does not make the cheap fix useless. It makes it targeted. And targeted fixes are exactly what disappear first in industries built on all or nothing messaging. Because sometimes a small intervention solves a meaningful part of the problem is not a sexy sales pitch. It doesn't sell packages. It doesn't justify replacement. It doesn't generate recurring service plans. It just quietly works. And quiet solutions are the easiest ones to bury. That is the deeper reason this style performs so well online. Every script is really telling the viewer the same thing. You were trained to overlook the middle ground. Not broken enough to replace, not harmless enough to ignore, just manageable enough to steal back yourself. That is where cheap chemistry lives. That is where self-reliance lives. And that is where these channels build loyalty. So if you wake up every winter to fogged windows, water beads on the inside glass, damp sills, and the creeping suspicion that somebody is eventually going to quote you 4 figures to solve the issue, stop for a second before you surrender the whole thing to the replacement machine. Look at the surface, look at the edge, look at the pattern, look at the joint, look at what is wet first. Because the first place water appears is often the first place knowledge disappeared. And once you understand that, condensation stops being a vague seasonal annoyance and becomes what it really is, a visible clue, a map. A signal telling you exactly where air, cold, moisture, and material are meeting in the wrong way. Fix that meeting point and the problem changes. Maybe not with a miracle, but with something the market hates almost as much, clarity. If this changed the way you think about sweating windows, dripping panes, or winter moisture on interior glass, share it with someone who is still wiping the same sill every morning and calling it normal. Subscribe if you want more buried home systems, old maintenance knowledge, and cheap hardware store chemistry that collides with expensive modern advice. Because the next vault opens soon, and once you see what they turned into a premium service, you'll never walk through a hardware store the same way again.